Caleb Whitaker hadn't spoken a woman's name in 3 years. Not since he put flowers on a grave and rode back to an empty mountain. He wasn't looking for anyone. He wasn't waiting for anything. Then she fell through his gate at midnight, bleeding and breathless, with 8 armed riders closing in behind her, and she looked up at him with eyes that had already given up on people and whispered, "Please, don't send me back." Caleb didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He just stepped forward. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, follow along until the very last word and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1884 came to Black Pine Mountain the way it always did. Slow and heavy smelling of pine sap and dry creek beds. The kind of heat that pressed down on a man's shoulders and reminded him he was working land that didn't belong to him so much as he belonged to it. Caleb Whitaker had been on that mountain for 11 years. He'd built the ranch with his own hands, post by post, board by board. Starting the summer, he turned 27 and deciding after everything that had happened that he didn't need much. A roof, a fire, work that was honest, animals that didn't lie to you. He'd had more than that once. He didn't think about it most days. Most days. He was out checking the north fence line when the light started to go, that long golden Montana twilight that stretched itself out like it didn't want to leave. He'd found 2 broken posts that afternoon, probably from where the elk had pushed through again, and he was working by feel more than sight, driving the post back into the hard summer earth, sweat running down the back of his neck. That's when he heard it. Not the elk, not the wind. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Moving fast, moving toward him from down the valley. Caleb stopped driving the post. He straightened up slowly, the way a man does when his instincts are telling him something his eyes haven't confirmed yet. He turned and looked south down the long slope of the valley, where the trail came up from Ridgeline, and the town of Harrow Creek beyond it. 8 riders. He counted them without meaning to, just the way his mind worked, the way it had always worked. 8 horses, 8 men riding hard up the valley in the last of the fading light. That was too many men for a social call. He dropped the post driver and started back toward the main gate, not running. Caleb Whitaker didn't run without cause, but moving with purpose, his long strides eating up the ground between the fence line and the front of the property. He had his rifle at the ranch house. He had his sidearm on his hip. He had 11 years on this mountain, and he knew every sound it made, and right now it was making a sound he didn't like. He was 50 yards from the gate when he saw her. She came out of the tree line to the east, not on the trail, not on any path. He knew, just appeared at the edge of the dark tree line, the way something desperate appears when it has run out of options and has chosen direction over safety. She was on horseback, her horse blowing hard and stumbling on the uneven ground. And even from 50 yards, even in the failing light, he could see she was barely holding on. She made it through the gate ahead of him by 10 seconds. Then the horse stopped finally, like it had given everything it had and wasn't giving any more, and she slid off the side of it, rather than dismounted, more of a controlled fall than anything else, and hit the dirt just inside his gate on her hands and knees. Caleb reached her in 3 strides. She looked up at him. Her face was dirty. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled and dried and bled again. Her hair had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into and was hanging across her face in dark tangles. Her dress, once practical, maybe once even nice, was torn at the hem and at the left shoulder, and there was a dark stain on her sleeve that he didn't look at twice because he already knew what it was. Her eyes were gray. He noticed that even then, even in that moment, not because he was the kind of man who noticed things like that at the wrong time, but because her eyes were the sharpest thing about her. Everything else had been worn down by however many miles and however many hours it had taken to get to his gate. But her eyes were still clear, still present, still thinking. She looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger when they have decided in that half second whether or not to trust them. Then she said low and ragged, "Please, don't send me back." The riders hit the gate 30 seconds later. There were 8 of them, just as he'd counted, and they pulled up hard when they saw him standing there, standing between them and the woman behind him, which was not something he'd consciously decided, but was apparently something his body had decided for him. He had maybe a second to register details. Dark riding clothes, no ranch markings he recognized, and the kind of organized quiet that told him these men weren't strangers to each other or to this kind of work. The man at the front was built like a side of beef and had a face that looked like it had never once been surprised by anything. He looked down at Caleb with the particular expression of a man who was accustomed to people moving out of his way. "That woman is property of Harrison Vane," he said. Not a question, not an explanation, just a statement delivered like a deed of title. "Stand aside." Caleb looked at him. He looked at the 7 men behind him. He looked at the woman on the ground behind him. She had gotten to her feet. By then he could hear her, and he thought about what she'd said. "Please, don't send me back." He'd heard that particular kind of please before. He'd heard it once from a dog someone had been kicking, and once from a man who'd been cheated out of everything he owned. It was the please of a person who had run out of other words. He put his thumbs in his belt and said, "She came here under my protection." The lead writer stared at him. "You don't know what you're doing," the man said. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Caleb said. "I'm telling you that it's full dark, and this is my land, and you're not welcome on it. Ride back down that valley, and don't come up it again tonight." There was a long silence, the kind of silence that has weight. Then the lead writer looked past him, looked at the woman, and something moved across his face. That wasn't anger exactly, but was colder than anger. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "I don't reckon it is." They rode out. Caleb watched them until they disappeared into the dark at the bottom of the valley. Then he turned around. She was standing just inside the gate, holding onto the post with one hand, not because she was weak, he'd already revised that assessment, but because she was being practical about the fact that her legs had earned a rest. Her horse was standing nearby, with its head down, sides heaving. "Your horse needs water," Caleb said. She blinked. Whatever she'd expected him to say, that wasn't it. She started. "There's a trough by the barn. I'll see to him." He paused. "You should come inside. That cut on your head needs cleaning." She didn't move right away. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes like she was still running the calculation, like trust was an equation she'd been burned by before, and she wasn't going to rush through it again. "I don't need your charity," she said. "Didn't offer any," he said. "Offered water for your horse and a look at that cut. That's just practical." Another pause. Then something in her face settled just slightly. Not relaxed, not softened. Just settled like a decision made. "My name is Eleanor Carter," she said. "Caleb Whitaker," he said. "This is my ranch." He looked at her once more, then looked at the horse. "Come on, then." She sat at his kitchen table and didn't touch the coffee he put in front of her for the first 2 minutes. He noticed. He didn't comment. He cleaned the cut on her forehead with a cloth, and the whiskey he kept for exactly this kind of practical purpose, and she held completely still for all of it, which told him she'd had wounds cleaned before and knew how to manage pain. "How far did you ride?" he asked. "Since before sunrise," she said. He did the math on that and kept his face neutral. "Alone." "Since midday. I had a companion who turned back at Ridgeline." A pause. "He was paid to turn back at Ridgeline." Caleb tied off the bandaged clean linen, the good kind he kept for the ranch hands when they got themselves torn up, and sat back. "Who is Harrison Vane?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee. "A man who needs something I have," she said, "and has decided that getting it is more important than whether I'm willing to give it." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It isn't." He didn't push. That was one of the things that mountain living had taught him, when to push and when to let a thing sit. She'd tell him or she wouldn't, and driving at her when she'd just ridden since sunrise with a gash on her head and 8 men on her trail was not going to get him the truth anyway. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "Small, beds made, door has a bolt on the inside. She looked at him again, that measuring look, the one that didn't quite trust, but was beginning to consider it. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me." "No," he said, "I don't." "Then why?" He stood up and took his coffee to the window, looked out at the dark mountain, thought about the various answers he could give her, about principle, about the look on her face when she'd said please, about the way the lead writer had said property of Harrison Vane, like she was a piece of furniture. "Because you came here," he said finally. "And because I told them you were under my protection, and I don't say things I don't mean." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Most men would have handed me over." "Most men," he agreed, and left it at that. She slept with the door bolted. He knew because he heard the bolt slide home at some point past midnight, after the silence in the hall had gone long enough that he'd started to think she was sitting up in there rather than lying down. The sound of that bolt, the small deliberate click of it, told him more about Eleanor Carter than anything she'd said at the table. It told him that she had learned to be careful, that she had learned it the hard way and recently, that she was not paranoid so much as educated. He lay in his own room and listened to the mountain. The mountain was quiet. Whatever those riders were doing, they weren't doing it on his land tonight. He didn't sleep much. By the time the sun was up, she was already in the barn. He found her there when he went to do the morning feed, not tending her own horse, which he'd expected, but working her way methodically through his, checking their feet, checking their water, running her hands along their necks, the way a person does when they know horses and have a relationship with them that goes back further than yesterday. His bay mare Duchess, who did not care for strangers as a general principle, was standing with her head low and her eyes half closed, while Eleanor Carter ran a brush down her flank. Caleb stopped in the barn doorway. Eleanor didn't turn around. She knew he was there, he could tell by the slight shift in her posture, but she kept working. "She's a good horse," Eleanor said. "Bit of muscle tension in her left shoulder. You working her on uneven ground?" "North fence line is rocky," he said. "She'd benefit from a lighter load up there for a few days." "I'll keep that in mind." He came in and took the feed down from the shelf. "You know horses." "My father had a ranch. Before." A pause. "Before." He didn't ask about the before. Not yet. "I have 3 ranch hands," he said. "Tom, Silas, and Jed. They'll be here by mid-morning. I should tell you that before they arrive." She stopped brushing and looked at him over Duchess's back. "Tell me what?" she said. "That they'll have opinions about me. That they're good men," he said. "But they're curious men, and they'll wonder." "What will you tell them?" He poured the feed and thought about it. "That you're staying on," he said. "For now. That's enough." She went back to brushing. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Caleb." "Caleb." She said his name once like she was trying the weight of it. "Those men last night, they won't stop." "I know." "And you're all right with that? Knowing they'll come back?" He looked at her across the back of the horse, this woman he'd known for less than 12 hours. This woman who'd appeared out of a tree line like something his mountain had decided to keep, and who was now standing in his barn, telling him with her eyes that she was giving him a chance to reconsider. "I said what I said at that gate," he told her. "I don't walk things back." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded once small, like she was filing it away somewhere private. And she went back to brushing the horse. Tom Garrett was the first to arrive, and Tom Garrett had been alive for 61 years and working ranches for 45 of them, which meant that very little surprised him, and he considered most things that other people called problems to be merely logistics. He walked into the barn, took one look at Eleanor Carter, mucking out a stall with a concentration that suggested she was either very industrious or very angry about something, and looked at Caleb. "She's stayin'," he said. "For now," Caleb said. Tom nodded. "She any good with a horse?" "Duchess let her brush her this morning." Tom's eyebrows went up. For Tom Garrett, this was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. He looked at Eleanor again. "You need another pair of boots," he called across the barn. "There's an extra pair in the tack room if yours are done for." Eleanor looked up from the stall. She looked at the old man taking his measure the same way she'd taken Caleb's. "Mine are fine," she said, "but thank you." Tom nodded like this was the correct answer and went to get his own work started. Silas Webb was 24 and the kind of young that made a person feel both fond and exhausted. He arrived an hour after Tom and immediately noticed Eleanor in a way that was not inappropriate but was definitely very thorough. He also looked at Caleb with an expression of 17 different unasked questions. Caleb answered none of them, which had always been his preferred method with Silas's expressions. Jed Calloway said even less than Caleb, which was a considerable achievement. He arrived, saw Eleanor, said "ma'am" with a tip of his hat, and went to work. That was Jed. By noon, Eleanor was working alongside them, like she'd been there a season. Not because she was performing usefulness. Caleb had seen enough performance to know the difference. She was working because that was what she did. Because staying still meant thinking, and he suspected Eleanor Carter had things she was not yet ready to think about. It was Tom who came to him that afternoon while Eleanor was up at the house taking a rest from the sun. "She's running," Tom said. Not a question. "Yes," Caleb said. "From who?" "Man named Harrison Vane. Sent 8 riders last night." Tom was quiet for a moment. He chewed on something tobacco or thought it was hard to tell with Tom. "You know who Harrison Vane is?" Tom asked. "No, I do." Tom looked up at the mountain. Harrison Vane owns the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company. Buys up territory through legal maneuvering, mostly some of it legal, some of it not. Been doing it for years. The kind of man the law in Harrow Creek doesn't argue with. Caleb felt something cold move through his chest that wasn't quite the summer air. "Then what does he want with her?" he said. Tom looked at him. "I don't know," he said, "but a man like that doesn't send 8 riders after a lone woman for no reason." Caleb said nothing. "You sure about this?" Tom said, quietly, not challenging asking, the way one man asks another when he wants to be certain they've thought it through. Caleb looked out across his land, the mountain, the valley, 11 years of work in every post and board and water line. "I told her she was under my protection," he said. Tom nodded slowly. "Then I reckon we are too," the old man said. She found him at the fence line that evening, the same north stretch he'd been working when all of this started. She came up behind him quietly enough that he heard her footsteps, but didn't hear her approach, which told him something about how she moved when she wasn't exhausted. "You spoke to your man Tom today," she said. "He asked questions." "What did you tell him?" "That a man named Harrison Vane sent 8 riders after you last night." He drove a staple into the post. "He told me who Vane is." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you know," she said. "I know he's the kind of man who acquires things," Caleb said. "Land mostly, and that people who oppose him tend to have difficulties." "My father opposed him," she said. Caleb stopped working. He turned and looked at her. She was watching the valley below, the way she always watched it, always looking at the direction trouble would come from. It was so habitual with her that she probably didn't notice she was doing it anymore. "What happened to your father?" he said. "He died," she said. 2 years ago. In what was recorded as a riding accident." She paused. "He was an excellent rider." The evening air sat between them for a moment. "Ellie!" Caleb said the shortened name came out before he thought about it, and she turned to look at him when he said it, and he didn't walk it back. "What do you have on him?" She reached into the pocket of her dress and held out a small leather case, the kind a woman might keep letters in, except that it was very flat and very worn, in a way that suggested it had been carried close for a long time. "Documents," she said. "Survey records, copies of deeds with forged notarizations, a ledger page showing payments to 2 county officials." She paused. "And a signed letter from Harrison Vane himself, instructing one of his agents to acquire the Carter land by any means necessary, written 3 weeks before my father's accident." Caleb looked at the leather case. "That's enough to hang a man," he said. "It's enough to ruin one," she agreed. "Which is why he wants it back. Why hasn't he gotten it if he had 8 men on you?" "Because I've had it in my hands the entire time and I run fast when I need to." She met his eyes steadily. "And because there's a copy, at a law office in Miles City. I sent it before I left Harrow Creek. If anything happens to me, it goes to the Federal District Court." She paused. "Harrison Vane knows that, which is why his men have been told to bring me back alive." Caleb absorbed this. He thought about the lead writer's voice, property of Harrison Vane, the particular coldness of it. "What were you planning to do," he said, "when you found somewhere to stop?" She looked at the valley for a long moment. "I was going to write to the Federal Circuit Court myself," she said. "I was going to find a judge who wasn't already bought." Another pause smaller. "And I was going to try to not get killed while I did it." "That's a lot to do alone." "I've been doing a lot alone," she said. He looked at her, this woman standing on the edge of his mountain at dusk, carrying a leather case that could end a powerful man with a bandage above her eye, and 3 hours of sleep and 2 years of running already behind her. And something shifted in him. Not the dramatic kind of shift that changes a man in an instant. The slower, quieter kind, like a door he hadn't known was closed, swinging open just enough to let light through. "You're not doing it alone anymore," he said. She looked at him. "Caleb," she said, "you don't know me." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." "Maybe." He turned back to the fence. "But I know a rigged game when I hear about one. And I know what kind of man sends riders after a woman in the dark." He drove another staple. "And I know what I said at that gate." A long silence. Then she said very quietly, so quietly that he might have imagined it if the evening hadn't been so still. "Thank you." He didn't say "you're welcome." He just worked. And she stood there in the evening light for a little while longer, watching the valley with eyes that were a little less watchful than they'd been the night before. That night, Caleb heard the bolt on her door slide home again. But it slid slower this time, like a woman who wasn't yet willing to stop being careful, but who was, for the first time in a long time, beginning to wonder if she might not have to be. He lay in his room and listened to the mountain. The mountain was quiet. Down in the valley, somewhere in the dark between Black Pine and Harrow Creek, 8 men were camped, waiting for morning. Waiting for orders from a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Caleb stared at the ceiling. He thought about the leather case. He thought about the letter with Vane's signature. He thought about a man who had died in a riding accident when he was an excellent rider. He thought about Eleanor Carter's eyes, clear and gray, and still thinking even when everything else had been ground down. And he thought about the fact that somewhere in the darkness below his mountain, a very powerful man had decided that this woman did not matter. Caleb Whitaker had a different opinion on that subject. He closed his eyes and let the mountain carry him toward morning. Tomorrow, he thought, would require a clearer head. He'd start by writing down to Tom's, checking what he knew about the Federal Circuit schedule, and sending a wire to a man he knew in Miles City who had never once in 20 years done a dishonest thing. And he'd do all of that before the sun got high. Because Eleanor Carter had been running for 2 years, and she'd come to his gate at the end of a very long day, and asked him for one thing. He wasn't the kind of man who let a thing like that go. The wire went out before sunrise. Caleb rode down to Harrow Creek himself, before the town was properly awake, before the mercantile had its shutters open or the livery had its doors swung wide. He tied his horse at the post outside the telegraph office and waited the 4 minutes it took the operator, a young man named Dell, who had the disposition of someone who wished people would sleep later, to unlock the door and get his equipment running. "Miles City," Caleb said. "To a man named Franklin Dade at the law offices of Dade and Morse." Dell wrote it down without looking up. Caleb dictated the message, short, specific. He told Franklin Dade that he had a party at Black Pine Ranch who needed legal consultation regarding documentation of fraud and land misappropriation in Harrow Creek County. He asked Franklin to come himself if he could, and to come quietly, and to tell no one in Harrow Creek that he was coming. Dell read it back. "Send it twice," Caleb said. Dell blinked. "Twice. Twice." He paid the man, walked back to his horse, and rode back up the mountain in the early light. He passed two of Vane's riders on the road. He recognized them by their horses, the same dark animals from the night before. And he looked at them, and they looked at him, and nobody said a word. They pulled their horses to the side of the road and let him pass, which told him something. Vane wanted Eleanor, not a confrontation. Not yet. He was a man who operated through legal channels when he could, through paper and leverage, and the particular pressure that money applied to everyone it touched. 8 riders in the dark was one thing. Whatever came next would be dressed up to look like something else. Caleb needed to be ready for dressed up. When he got back to the ranch, Eleanor was at the kitchen table with Tom. This was not what he expected to find. Tom had a cup of coffee, and Eleanor had a cup of coffee, and between them on the table was a piece of paper that Eleanor had been writing on, and the two of them were talking in the low, focused way that people talk when they are working through a problem that matters. They both looked up when he came in. "Tom knows the county land record system," Eleanor said. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a statement offered like information she was assuming he'd want. "Been following Vane's acquisitions for 3 years," Tom said. "Never had a reason to do anything about it. Seemed like he always had everything covered legally." He looked at Eleanor. "Until now." Caleb poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. "What did you find?" he said. Eleanor slid the paper toward him. She'd been writing names, property names, parcel numbers, dates of transfer. Tom had been filling in additional information alongside her entries in his cramped old man handwriting. 14 parcels, Eleanor said, in 3 years. 8 of them transferred after what the records call voluntary sale. But 3 of those families left the county entirely within 6 months of the sale. One family, the Hendersons, their patriarch, died 4 months before the sale. His widow sold at 1/3 of market value. And the Henderson widow is now living with her daughter in Wyoming, Tom said. Because I asked her once at the church social 2 years ago why she'd sold. She said a man had come to her and told her the title was disputed and she should settle before it went to court. He paused. Except the title wasn't disputed. I checked. Caleb looked at the paper. So they manufactured legal pressure, he said. Or the appearance of it, Eleanor said. That's what my father tried to document. That's what got him killed. She said the last 3 words without inflection, without drama, just laid them on the table like the fact they were. The Carter land was parcel 11, transferred to the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company 8 months after his death when I signed the papers. She paused. They told me there were outstanding debts against the estate, that I had to sell or go to court. I was 25 years old and I had no money and no lawyer and... She stopped. She looked at her coffee. I signed, she said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. You were 25 years old and they'd just killed your father, Tom said, with the particular bluntness of a man who'd been alive long enough to call things what they were. Ain't nothing in that, that's your fault, miss. Eleanor looked at the old man. Something moved across her face just briefly. Just a flicker, the way a person's face moves when someone says the one thing they've been telling themselves for 2 years and still haven't fully believed. She looked back at the paper. The point, she said, is that I have documentation for our parcel and 2 others. If we can corroborate with additional records, and if Tom can identify the other families. I can find them, Tom said. Then we have a pattern, Eleanor said. Not just one incident. A pattern. That's what a federal court needs. Caleb looked at her across the table. He thought about what she'd said the night before. I've been doing a lot alone. And now she was sitting here with an old ranch hand she'd met 12 hours ago building a legal case at a kitchen table before the morning was properly underway. She didn't wait to be saved. She just needed somewhere to stand. I sent a wire to Franklin Dade in Miles City this morning, Caleb said. Eleanor looked up sharply. You know a lawyer. Knew his father. Franklin's honest, and he's not afraid of money, which is a rare thing in this territory. He looked at her. He should be here in 2-3 days if he can come." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. "You did that before you even knew what I had," she said. "I knew enough," he said. Tom stood up with his coffee, made the particular noise an older man makes when his knees register their objections, and headed for the door. "I'm going to start making a list of names," he said. "People I know that Vane might have pressured, people who might be willing to talk to a lawyer." He paused at the door. "That all right with you, miss?" Eleanor looked at him, and this time the thing that moved across her face stayed a little longer. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Tom." Tom nodded and went. By midday, Silas had spotted the riders. He came in from the east pasture at a near jog, which for Silas was the equivalent of anyone else running, and found Caleb and Eleanor at the barn. "Two of them," he said, catching his breath. "Up on the ridge, just sitting, not coming down." Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Watching the ranch." "Watching you," Caleb said. He looked back at Silas. "They come any closer?" "No, just sitting." "Then leave them." Silas looked uncertain. He was 24 and had the kind of energy that preferred action to waiting. "We just let them sit up there." "A man sitting on a ridge is a man who hasn't decided to move yet," Caleb said. "We want to know where they are, so we leave them where we can see them." Silas absorbed this with the expression of someone who understood the logic but didn't particularly like it. Also, Caleb said, "Ride to Mrs. Paulson's place today when you're done with the east pasture. Tell her I'd like a conversation if she's willing. Don't say why." "Mrs. Paulson." Silas blinked. "The widow woman on the creek road?" "That's right." Silas glanced at Eleanor, back at Caleb, made the face of a man who knew he wasn't being given the full picture, and had decided that was probably fine. "Yes, sir," he said, and went. Eleanor was looking at Caleb. "Mrs. Paulson," she said. "Her husband sold to Vane 18 months ago. The week after her husband sold, he had a stroke. He's been bedridden since." He met her eyes. She told Tom she's always thought the timing was peculiar. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "You've been listening," she said. "Tom talks," he said. "I listen." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face as a full smile, but it made it as far as the corners of her eyes, which he was starting to understand, was as far as she was currently willing to let things go. "Good habit," she said. What happened that afternoon was the first thing Caleb hadn't anticipated. He'd put Jed on the north perimeter. Quiet, reliable Jed, who moved through land like he was part of it, and he'd been working in the barn with Eleanor, going through the survey maps she'd pulled from her leather case, and cross-referencing them with Tom's hand-drawn records of the county when they heard the horse. One horse. Slow. Deliberate. Coming up the main road. Caleb was at the barn door before Eleanor had time to react, and his hand was on his sidearm, not drawn, not yet, but resting there, which was a different thing. The rider who came through the gate was a man he recognized. Deputy Earl Sims. Harrow Creek's law, insofar as Harrow Creek had law, which was not a great deal. Sims was 50, and had the look of a man who had made a series of small accommodations over a long career until the accommodations had become the career. He was not a bad man. Caleb thought he'd never thought Sims was a bad man, but he was a man who knew which way the wind blew and dressed accordingly. He pulled up and looked at Caleb. "Afternoon, Caleb," he said. "Earl," Caleb said. Sims's eyes moved to the barn where Eleanor had appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was apologetic in the way of a man who has been sent to do something he doesn't entirely want to do. "I've had a complaint filed," Sims said. "What kind of complaint?" "Harrison Vane is claiming that a woman on his employ is being held at this property against her will." He said it carefully, the way a man reads a document he didn't write. "He's asking me to make an inquiry." Caleb looked at him. Eleanor walked forward from the barn doorway and stood beside Caleb. She'd made that choice herself. He hadn't asked her to, hadn't gestured, hadn't so much as glanced at her. She just moved and stood there. "I am not an employee of Harrison Vane," she said very clearly. "I was never an employee of Harrison Vane. My name is Eleanor Carter. I am a guest on this property, and I am here of my own free will." Sims looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, and in his voice was the tone of a man conveying a warning without being able to say it directly. "Mr. Vane is a significant presence in this county." "I'm aware of that," Eleanor said. "He has resources that Mr. Whitaker here may not—" "Deputy Sims." Eleanor's voice didn't raise, didn't harden. It just became very exact. "I have told you who I am, and where I am by choice. That is your inquiry answered. Is there anything else?" Sims sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the two of them standing there together in front of the barn. He sighed the sigh of a man who had been hoping this would go differently. "No, ma'am," he said. "I reckon that's the inquiry answered." He looked at Caleb. "Caleb, you keep your eyes open." "I always do," Caleb said. Sims turned his horse and rode back down the road. Eleanor watched him go. She didn't move until he was out of sight. Then she said, "He's going to report back that I denied Vane's claim." "Yes." "And Vane is going to escalate." "Yes." She turned and looked at Caleb. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were doing that clear thinking thing they did when she was working through a problem. But underneath it, just underneath, was something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, and was probably both of those things worn thin by 2 years of being both of those things. "Then we need Franklin Dade here faster than 2 or 3 days, she said. "I'll send another wire tonight," he said. She nodded, turned back toward the barn, then stopped. "He told you to keep your eyes open," she said without turning around. "That was a warning." "Yes. He was warning you, not me." Caleb thought about that for a moment, about what it meant that Sims had looked at him when he said it, about what it meant that Sims had bothered to say it at all. "Earl Sims has been a deputy for 23 years, Caleb said. "He knows what a rigged game looks like. He just hasn't found a way to play it differently yet." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone gets to choose their moment," she said. She went back into the barn. Silas came back from the Paulson place at dusk, and he came back with Mrs. Paulson herself. This was not what Caleb had asked for, but it was not entirely surprising, because Mrs. Paulson was a woman who, when told that a man at Black Pine Ranch wanted a conversation, apparently decided that if she was going to have a conversation, she'd rather have it face to face. She was 62, angular, with the kind of straight spine that comes from refusing to let hard things bend you. And she came through the door of Caleb's kitchen with the manner of someone who had decided on the road here that she was going to say things she had been sitting on for a very long time. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her. "You're the Carter girl," Mrs. Paulson said. "Daniel Carter's daughter." Eleanor went very still. "You knew my father. He came to see my husband 3 months before he died," Mrs. Paulson said. She sat down at the table without being asked. "He had papers, survey documents. He wanted Harold to sign a statement confirming that men from the land company had come to us with false information about our title." She looked at her hands. "Harold was afraid. He said no." She paused. 6 weeks later, your father had his accident. And 3 months after that, Harold signed our land over and had his stroke." The kitchen was very quiet. "Mrs. Paulson," Eleanor said, and her voice had changed. It had gone softer, but not weaker, the kind of soft that comes from understanding something deeply. "Are you willing to say that to a lawyer?" Mrs. Paulson looked at her with eyes that had been making up their mind for 18 months. "I have been waiting," she said, "for someone to ask me. Ask." Something shifted in the room. Caleb could feel it the way the air in a place shifts when a thing that's been held back for a long time finally starts to move. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over Mrs. Paulson's. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The older woman looked down at Eleanor's hand. Then she straightened her already straight spine and something in her face that had been quietly grieving for a very long time steadied itself. "You should know," Mrs. Paulson said, "that I am not the only one. The Briggs family over on the Eastern Creek. The Morenos up at the edge of the timber. There are others. People who've been afraid." She looked at Caleb. People who might not be afraid if they thought someone was actually going to do something about it. "Someone is," Caleb said. Mrs. Paulson looked at him with the particular assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between a man who said things and a man who meant them. She nodded once. "Then I'll stay for supper," she said, "and we'll talk." Tom's face when he came in for supper and found Mrs. Paulson at the table was a study in the particular surprise of an old man who has spent 3 years watching a situation and has suddenly found it moving faster than he expected. He sat down across from her. "Agnes," he said. "Tom Garrett," she said. "You came down off the mountain." "I did." "I didn't think you'd—" "Well," she said, "here I am." Something in Tom's expression did a slow, quiet thing that Caleb recognized as what Tom looked like when he was moved but wasn't going to show it. The old man reached for the coffee and poured himself a cup, and the conversation moved on. But Caleb saw it. After Mrs. Paulson left, Silas rode with her back to the creek road because the dark was full on. By then the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a summer night that had been too full to leave room for anything else. Eleanor was at the table going through her papers again, reorganizing them, making notations in a small, precise handwriting that he'd noticed earlier was completely at odds with how she looked, trail-worn and still in borrowed work clothes, but made sense when you remembered she'd been a clerk, had worked with documents, had trained herself to think in evidence. Tom had gone to his bunk. Jed had gone to his. Caleb sat across from Eleanor and watched her work without intending to watch her, and after a while she said without looking up, "You're staring." "Thinking," he said. "About what?" He considered. "About what your father was trying to do," he said, "and about how long he'd been doing it alone." Eleanor's pen stopped moving. She didn't look up. Right away, she looked at the paper in front of her, and then slowly she looked up. "He'd been collecting information for almost a year," she said. "By himself. He didn't tell me how dangerous it was until it was already dangerous." A pause. "He didn't want me involved." "He was trying to protect you. I know." Her voice had something in it now, not quite grief, not quite anger, something that was both of those things pressed thin by time. He thought if he could just get enough together, bring it to the right person, that it would be enough. That the right person would handle it. She looked back down at the paper. He believed in the system. "Maybe he wasn't wrong," Caleb said. "He's dead," she said. "And you're still carrying his evidence," Caleb said. "And there's a lawyer coming from Miles City and an old woman down the creek road who just said she'd testify." He paused. Maybe the system just needed more time. Eleanor looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the clear measuring quality of her gaze gave way to something less guarded, something that was tired and young and more frightened than she was going to say out loud. "I'm 27 years old," she said quietly. "And I've been running for 2 years, and I am so—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked back at the paper. "I'm tired," she said quietly, and then said nothing else because she'd said the thing and there wasn't anything more to add to it. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You're not running tonight." She glanced up. "Tonight you're at a table," he said, "and there's coffee in the pot, and you've got more allies than you started this morning with, and none of those men on the ridge came down today." He met her eyes. "Take the win, Ellie, even the small ones." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face went very still. The kind of still that isn't emptiness, but is the opposite. A kind of fullness pressing against the inside of a person and not quite finding a way out yet. "I don't know how to do that," she said softly. "Take the small wins." "I know," he said, "but you'll learn." She looked at him. The lamp between them cast its light unevenly, the way lamps do, and in that light, Her face had less armor on it than he'd seen yet. Then she said, "Why did you stay on this mountain, Caleb, 11 years, alone?" He'd known a question like that was coming eventually. He'd been on the mountain long enough to know that things that were building always arrived. "I had a woman once," he said. "Her name was Nora. We were going to be married in the spring." He kept his voice level the way he'd learned to keep it over 11 years. "She got sick the winter before. It was fast." He paused. "I buried her in March, and then I stayed. Because I didn't know what else to do with the land after that. And then staying became the life." Eleanor was very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 11 years ago." "That doesn't make it smaller." He looked at her. He thought about saying something else, something that would redirect the conversation, put the armor back where it belonged, move them back onto safer ground. But the night was quiet, and Mrs. Paulson had come down off the mountain, and Eleanor Carter had said, "I'm tired," like it cost her something. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat in that for a moment, two people with losses between them, neither of them pretending the losses were small. Then Eleanor looked down at her papers. "I should finish this," she said. "You should sleep," he said. She almost smiled again, the almost smile that lived at the corners of her eyes. "One more hour." "One more hour," he agreed, and stood up and refilled both their coffees and sat back down. And that was how they spent the rest of that evening, her working, and him reading the week-old newspaper he'd never gotten around to, and the lamp burning steady between them. The ranch was quiet. The mountain was quiet. Outside somewhere on the ridge, two of Vane's men were watching the dark. But in the kitchen of Black Pine Ranch, there was coffee and lamplight, and two people who had each spent a long time alone, and were without quite saying so, beginning to understand what it might feel like not to be. The newspaper arrived 3 days later, not Franklin. Dade, not yet, but a rider from Harrow Creek, and it was Silas who brought it in from the road with an expression Caleb couldn't read. He held it out. Caleb took it. The front page of the Harrow Creek Courier, published 2 days prior. There, in the third column, under a heading that said, "Fugitive from Civil Proceedings, Miss Eleanor Carter, formerly of Carter Creek, is sought by order of the Harrow Creek County Court, in relation to documents alleged to have been unlawfully removed from the offices of the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company. Any person with knowledge of Miss Carter's whereabouts is urged to contact Deputy Sims at the county office. A reward of $200 is offered for information leading to her location." Caleb read it twice. Then he walked into the house. Eleanor was at the table. She looked up when he came in and saw his face before she saw the paper. "What happened?" she said. He set the paper on the table in front of her. She read it. She read it again. Her face did something complex and controlled. He could see her working through it, working through the anger and the fear and whatever else was underneath those, the way a person rearranges their face when they can't afford to react the way they want to react. Then she looked up. "He's made it legal," she said. "He's made it look legal," Caleb said. "There's a difference. Not to most people in this county." "We're not arguing to most people in this county," he said. "We're arguing to a federal circuit court." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and he could see the tension in her spine, the very deliberate way she was holding herself together. "Caleb," she said, "I know. That reward, $200, is—" "I know what it is," he said. "In a county where some men earn $30 a month, 200 is a number that changes things." She turned around. Her eyes were very steady and very gray and very direct. "Your men," she said. "Tom, Silas, Jed. They—" "I'll talk to them," he said. "You can't know what they'll—" "I know what they'll do," he said. She looked at him with something that was trying very hard not to be desperation, but was getting close to the edges of it. "You can't be certain," she said. "I'm certain about Tom," he said. "Silas, He's 24 years old, and he does what he thinks is right when someone explains it to him clearly. Jed doesn't take money from people he works against. He met her eyes. And I'm not wrong about people very often, Ellie. She held his gaze. Then she said very quietly, I don't want anything to happen to them because of me. That's not your decision, he said. It's theirs. Caleb, it's theirs. He said it clearly, firmly, not unkind, but not willing to let her carry that weight either. You've been making yourself responsible for things you can't control for 2 years. You can stop that right now. Let people make their own choices. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the newspaper on the table, at her own name in print made into a criminal by a man who had the money to buy the machinery of law and point it wherever he wanted. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, when she folded them in front of her, were steady. All right, she said again. Then let's figure out what we do next. And they did. They were still at that table, papers spread between them. Tom and Jed and Silas brought in and consulted, and each one answering in his own way. Tom with a nod that settled the matter. Silas with the earnest conviction of the young Jed, with a single sentence that was more than enough, when the sound of a horse coming fast up the mountain road brought Caleb to the window. One rider, riding hard. Not Vane's men. Vane's men sat and watched. They didn't come hard up the road in daylight. Caleb went to the door. The rider pulled up at the gate, breathing hard from the pace. It was Dell, the telegraph operator, who had ridden up a mountain. He had no business riding in the middle of a workday, with the expression of a man who had looked at a message and decided it couldn't wait. Wire came in 20 minutes ago, Dell said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. From Miles City. I thought... He looked at Caleb. I thought you'd want it fast. Caleb took the paper and opened it. He read it. Then he turned back to the house, and he could feel everyone inside watching him through the window. He walked back in, set the wire on the table in front of Eleanor. She read it. Her chin came up. Arriving Harrow Creek Friday. Bringing colleague from U.S. Circuit Court. Vane known to us. Trust no one in county. Franklin Dade. Friday was 2 days away. Eleanor looked up at Caleb, and for the first time since she'd come through his gate with blood on her face and 8 riders behind her, something in her eyes stopped calculating and just breathed. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. Across the table, Tom was already reaching for another piece of paper, adding names to his list. The mountain outside was quiet and warm and full of summer, and 2 days felt for the first time like a distance that could be crossed. The 2 days felt like 2 weeks and passed like 2 hours, and neither of those things was comfortable. Caleb ran the ranch the way he always ran it, methodically, without waste, without panic. But underneath the routine, there was a tension that even the horses felt. Duchess kept pulling at her tie. The younger gelding, a 3-year-old they called Scout, refused his feed 2 mornings in a row. Animals always knew. Eleanor knew too. She worked harder those 2 days than she'd worked since she arrived up before sunrise last to stop at dark, and Caleb understood what she was doing because he'd done the same thing himself at various points in his life. When you couldn't control what was coming, you controlled what was in front of you. You kept your hands busy so your mind didn't eat you alive. Tom kept adding names to his list. By Thursday evening, he had 11 families. 11 families who had sold to Harrison Vane's company under circumstances that had made Tom uncomfortable at the time and made him furious now that he was writing them down one by one and looking at the pattern they made. Silas had ridden to 3 of them at Tom's direction, careful, quiet, not announcing anything, and had come back each time with the same report. People were scared, people were angry, and people were willing to talk to someone if that someone looked like they could actually do something. Jed said nothing and sharpened every tool on the property to a degree that was probably unnecessary, but was a useful indicator of where his feelings were sitting. It was Thursday night when Eleanor came to find Caleb at the fence line. He heard her coming this time. She was moving with more noise than she used to, which he'd noticed over the past 2 days, and understood meant she was doing it on purpose, making herself audible because she'd figured out that he heard people approaching, and she didn't want to startle him. That kind of consideration was the sort of thing a person did when they were starting to care about someone else's comfort. He turned before she reached him. She had the leather case in her hands. "I want to show you something," she said. He waited. She opened the case and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. Not the survey documents, not the ledger page, but something smaller, older, handled more often. The fold lines were almost worn through. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it carefully, folded it. It was a letter. Handwritten in a man's hand, not small and precise like Eleanor's, but larger with the particular controlled slant of a man who'd learned to write by lantern light and had never quite lost the evidence of it. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, then things have gone the way I feared they might. I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. The truth is worth the cost, even when the cost is everything. You are the best thing I ever did in my life. And I need you to understand that you are not responsible for what happens to me. You didn't make the world dishonest. Don't you dare carry that. Find someone with the authority to act on what I've gathered. Trust carefully, but trust. The worst thing a person can do when they've been wronged is decide that being wronged means they're alone. You're not alone. You never were. Your father." Caleb refolded the letter. He held it a moment before handing it back. "He left it for you," he said. "In the lining of my traveling bag," she said. "I found it the morning after his funeral." Her voice was completely level, the way voices go when they have rehearsed a thing so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth by repetition. "I've read it probably 200 times. Caleb looked at her. "He was right," he said, "about not being alone." She met his eyes, and for a moment didn't say anything. Then she folded the letter back into the case with the same careful hands she'd used on everything that mattered to her, and she said, "I know that. I'm starting to know that." A beat. "I wanted you to read it because tomorrow is going to be complicated, and I don't know. I wanted you to know what kind of man my father was, before it gets complicated." "I know what kind of man your father was," Caleb said. "He raised you." That almost smile came again, closer this time, almost the whole way there. "Don't say things like that," she said. "I need to be steady tomorrow." "You'll be steady," he said. She looked at him one more moment, then turned and walked back to the house. He stood at the fence line and listened to the mountain, and thought about a man named Daniel Carter who had written a letter to his daughter by lamplight and hidden it in the lining of her bag so she'd find it after he was gone. The mountain didn't have anything to say about it. Sometimes it didn't. Franklin Dade arrived Friday morning at 9:30, and he did not arrive alone. He brought a colleague, a man named Judge Armand Tessier, who was 64 years old and had the face of a man who had been presented with every variety of human dishonesty over a long career and had developed an immunity to being surprised by any of it. He was a circuit court judge out of the federal district, and he had ridden 4 hours from Billings because Franklin Dade had sent him a message that apparently contained phrases significant enough to get a federal judge out of bed before sunrise. They came through the gate, and Caleb shook their hands at the door and brought them inside, and the kitchen that had been crowded with ranch hands and worried neighbors all week became something else, became a room with a kind of gravity in it, the particular gravity of official consequence entering an unofficial space. Eleanor was at the table. She stood when they came in. Franklin Dade looked at her and said, "Miss Carter, I'm glad you're alive." "So am I," she said, and the small, dry precision of it made the lawyer blink once in what might have been approval. Judge Tessier sat down at the table without preamble. He had a leather satchel with him that he set on the table and did not open. He looked at Eleanor with the particular attention of a man who has spent decades assessing the reliability of witnesses. "Miss Carter," he said, "I've been briefed by Mr. Dade. I want to hear it from you. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out and don't embellish anything. I don't need a story. I need facts." Eleanor sat down. She put the leather case on the table between them, and she talked. Caleb stood near the door and listened. He had heard most of it in pieces the night she'd told him about her father the morning with Tom, the long sessions over papers at the kitchen table. But he hadn't heard all of it at once, and hearing it all at once was a different thing. She laid it out clearly. Her father's discovery of irregularities in the county deed records his private investigation, his attempt to gather corroborating testimony from neighboring families. The men who had come to their ranch to warn him. The morning she had found him at the bottom of the creek ravine with his horse standing unhurt nearby. The death recorded as an accident. The legal pressure on the estate, the claim of debts that didn't exist, the offer to settle that had been structured so that refusing it would have cost more than accepting it. The papers she had signed at 25 years old with no lawyer and no money and no father and no one telling her she had any other choice. And then the part Caleb hadn't fully heard before. 3 months after I signed, Eleanor said, a man came to me. He said he was an agent of the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company, and he needed me to return some documents that had been among my father's effects. He was very polite. He said it was a formality. What documents? Judge Tessier said. The ones I have here. She put her hand flat on the leather case. I told him I didn't know what he was referring to. He came back twice more, each time less polite. The 4th time he came, he brought 2 other men with him, and he told me... She stopped, just briefly, just for a breath. He told me that women who involved themselves in business matters they didn't understand had a tendency to come to harm through their own ignorance, and that my father was a cautionary example. The kitchen was completely silent. Caleb felt something cold and very specific move through him. He kept his face still. Judge Tessier's expression didn't change, but his pen, which he had been using to take notes, stopped moving. That's when I left, Eleanor said. I took the documents which I had not given him because I had understood from the moment my father died what they were and why they mattered, and I left on a Tuesday night, and I have been moving since then. 2 years, Franklin Dade said quietly. 2 years, she said. Judge Tessier looked at the leather case. May I? He said. She opened it and laid every document on the table. What followed was 2 hours of quiet, meticulous work by the judge and the lawyer examining papers, making notes, asking Eleanor specific questions about provenance, about chain of custody, about where particular documents had come from, and how she knew what she knew. Tom was brought in and gave his account. Mrs. Paulson had come back up from the creek road Silas had ridden for her at first light, and she sat at the table and gave hers. Caleb made coffee and stayed out of the way. At one point he stepped outside and stood on the porch and breathed the summer air and let the mountain settle him, because the kitchen had the particular density of a room where important things were happening, and he was not a man who liked to stand in the middle of important rooms, feeling useless. Jed came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw Caleb. How's it going in there? Jed said. It's going, Caleb said. Jed nodded, looked out at the valley. Those 2 men are still on the ridge. I know. Want me to? No, Caleb said. Not yet. Jed nodded again and went back to his work. Caleb looked at the ridge. 2 riders sitting still, watching. He'd been watching them watch. And he'd noticed something over the past 2 days. They weren't just watching the ranch. They were watching the road, reporting movement, which meant Vane already knew that additional riders had come up from Harrow Creek that morning, which meant Vane knew something was happening. He went back inside. Judge Tessier sat back from the table at noon. He had the particular expression of a man who has confirmed something he suspected and finds no satisfaction in the confirmation. The forged notarizations alone are actionable, he said. But you have considerably more than that. The ledger entries cross-referenced with the deed transfers establish a pattern of coordinated fraud. The letter. He tapped Daniel Carter's letter with one finger, not Eleanor's letter, but a second one she'd produced from the case, a letter from Vane to his land agent that her father had obtained through means she hadn't explained and the judge hadn't pressed her on. This letter establishes Vane's personal direction of the scheme, which removes any argument of subordinate action. What does that mean for prosecution? Franklin said. It means, Judge Tessier said, that Harrison Vane is looking at federal fraud charges, multiple counts, conspiracy given the county officials who accepted payments. He paused. And depending on what an investigation of Daniel Carter's death produces, potentially more serious charges. The room was very quiet. Eleanor sat absolutely still. She had been still for a long time, the particular stillness of a person who has held something up for so long that when someone finally takes the weight, they don't know quite what to do with their hands. "What happens now?" Caleb said. Judge Tessier looked at him. "Now I draft an emergency injunction suspending Vane's land operations, pending federal investigation. It goes to the district court in Billings by telegraph today. By tonight, Harrison Vane is operating under federal constraint." He looked at Eleanor. "The reward notice in the county paper becomes null and void the moment that injunction is filed." "He'll fight it," Eleanor said. "He will," the judge agreed. "And he'll lose." He said it without satisfaction and without uncertainty, the flat declarative of a man who'd read the same documents she had and arrived at the same place. "The evidence you've preserved is comprehensive, Miss Carter. Your father was meticulous." Eleanor looked down at the table. "Yes," she said. "He was." Franklin. Dade cleared his throat gently. "There's one more thing, Eleanor." He pulled a document from his own satchel, not her documents, his own. "The copy you sent to our office in Miles City. I've had it reviewed. In the event that anything had happened to you, we were prepared to proceed on the basis of the copy alone." He paused. "I want you to know we would not have let it go, with or without you." Eleanor looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who hadn't been watching her face for the past several days, but Caleb saw it. The small, fundamental change of a person who has been carrying a weight alone and discovers that the weight was being shared without their knowledge. She pressed her lips together once. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. "Your father started something that deserved finishing," Franklin said. "I'm glad you made it here to finish it." The judge went to the telegraph office himself. Caleb rode with him to Harrow Creek, leaving Tom with instructions, and Jed in the yard with eyes on the ridge, and the injunction was filed at 2:47 that afternoon. The ride back up the mountain was quiet. Halfway up, the judge said, "She's remarkable, that woman." Caleb looked at the road ahead. "Yes," he said. 2 years, the judge said. Alone. With those documents. And she kept them intact and kept herself alive and waited for a situation where they'd mean something. He shook his head once. "I've seen men with considerably more resources fall apart under considerably less pressure." Caleb didn't say anything. "You know," the judge said conversationally, the way older men sometimes become conversational when they're actually making a specific point. "The law can handle Harrison Vane. The law can restore land file charges, pursue prosecution. The law can do quite a lot." He paused. "What the law cannot do is tell a woman who spent 2 years running that she's allowed to stop. That requires someone she trusts." Caleb looked at the judge. The judge looked at the road. "Just an observation," the judge said, "from an old man who's seen a great many things." They rode the rest of the way in silence. They were 200 yards from the gate when Caleb saw it. The 2 riders on the ridge were gone. He'd been watching that ridge every day since Eleanor arrived. For 3 days, those 2 riders had been as steady as rocks, up there not moving, just watching. And now they were gone. He said nothing to the judge. He just pushed his horse a little faster. Through the gate into the yard, and Tom was coming out of the barn with a look on his face that meant things had moved. "Half-hour ago," Tom said. "Ryder came up from town, went right to the house. Eleanor turned him away at the door. But he left something." Caleb was already off his horse. He went inside. Eleanor was at the table. She had a folded piece of paper in her hands, unfolded flat on the table in front of her, and she was looking at it with the particular expression of a person who has read a thing and is working out what it means. She looked up when Caleb came in. "He wants a meeting," she said. Caleb came to the table and looked at the paper. The handwriting was clean, practiced the handwriting of a man who understood that presentation mattered. Miss Carter. The legal situation has become unnecessarily complicated through misunderstanding on both sides. I believe a direct conversation would resolve matters to everyone's benefit. I will be at the old Hartley building in Harrow Creek tomorrow morning at 9. I ask only for 1 hour of your time. I give my word as a gentleman that you will be safe. Harrison Vane. Caleb read it twice. Then he set it down. He knows about the injunction, Caleb said. Dell would have telegraphed him the moment we filed. Yes, Eleanor said. He's trying to negotiate before it's fully in motion. Yes. He can't negotiate. The injunction isn't ours to withdraw. He looked at her. He knows that. Yes, Eleanor said. And the third yes was different from the first two. Quieter and with something underneath it that wasn't fear exactly, but was the recognition of a thing that hadn't landed yet. Then what does he actually want? Caleb said. Eleanor looked at the letter again. He wants to see me, she said. In person, without lawyers, without a federal judge. She paused. He wants to look at me and figure out how much I know about what he's done and who I've told, and whether there's any version of this where he comes out of it intact. Another pause. He wants information, and he's betting I'll be frightened enough or tired enough to walk into a room with him and give it to him. Caleb looked at her. You're not going, he said. She looked at him. Caleb. You're not going, he said again, and his voice was very quiet and very clear. Not angry, not commanding, just stating the only fact he was willing to accept on this particular point. She held his gaze. He knows things are moving against him. He's cornered. A cornered man is dangerous, Caleb said. I know, which is why you're not going. He gave his word. Harrison Vane's word, Caleb said, is what put your father in a creek bed. The room went very still. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, the part of her that had been outmaneuvering this man for 2 years, that had survived on planning and forethought, examining the angle, looking for whatever leverage a meeting might offer. And he could see the part of her that was tired. That had been calculating for so long that the machinery of it had worn grooves in her. I know, she said finally. I know I'm not going. She said it quietly, and there was something in it that was both relief and grief. The particular combination of those two things that comes when you stop fighting a battle you'd already won and let yourself feel the cost of it. She stopped. What? She looked at her hands on the table, at the letter, at the leather case that had been sitting at her left elbow for 3 days now, like a second heartbeat. I've been afraid of him for 2 years, she said. And I know the law is moving now. I know the injunction is filed. I know Franklin Dade is here, and the judge is here, and all of it is moving the right direction. She looked up. But right now tonight, with that letter on the table, I'm still afraid of him, and I am so tired of being afraid of him. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say that she was safe. He didn't say that everything was going to be fine. He'd lived long enough on a mountain with honest weather to know that saying those things was a way of not listening. Instead, he said, "What does afraid feel like for you right now?" She blinked. The question surprised her. He could see that it surprised her. She thought about it. Really thought about it, which he'd noticed she did actually engaged with things rather than just answering the surface. Like the floor isn't solid. Like I know everything we've done this week is real, and the injunction is real, and the judge is real, but there's still this part of my mind running the old calculation, looking for the exit, measuring the distance to the door. That's not fear, Caleb said. That's a habit you built to stay alive. Your mind's still running it because you haven't told it yet that you don't need it anymore. She looked at him. How do you tell it that? She said. How do you tell yourself you don't need something you've needed for 2 years? He thought about Nora. He thought about the winter she died and the spring after, and the way he'd kept going out to check on her horse for 3 months before he finally understood she wasn't coming back to ride him. "Slowly," he said. "You tell it slowly. And some days it listens, and some days it doesn't. But you tell it anyway." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them was the same lamp it always was burning, the same way, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, but something in the quality of the air between them had changed. Had been changing, he thought, since the first morning when he'd found her in the barn, with Duchess standing soft under her hands. Something had been building, the way weather builds, not any one thing, just pressure and temperature and time. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "Why haven't you asked me to leave?" He looked at her. "I told you why," he said, "the night you arrived. You said you don't walk things back." "That's right." "But it's more than that now," she said. "You know it is. It's been more than that for days." He didn't answer right away. He'd spent 11 years being a man who chose words carefully because he lived alone and had nobody to walk words back with, and the habit was deep. "Yes," he said. "It's more than that now." She held his gaze, and he held hers, and neither of them looked away. "I don't know what I'm going to do when this is over," she said. Quietly, honestly. "I don't have a home anymore. I don't have the ranch. I don't have—" She stopped. "I've been so focused on the evidence and the lawyers and surviving that I haven't let myself think about what happens after." "Think about it now," he said. "Now." "Why not?" She looked at him like the question was a door she hadn't expected to find there. "Because I'm frightened of the answer," she said. He reached across the table. He didn't take her hand, didn't presume that far, not yet. He just put his hand on the table close enough to be an offer. "The answer," he said, "doesn't have to be figured out tonight. But I want you to know that whatever it is, you don't have to figure it out the way you've been figuring things out for 2 years. He looked at her steadily. "You're not alone, Ellie. Stop treating yourself like you are." She looked at his hand on the table. Then she looked up at him. And then, finally, completely the whole way she smiled. It was not the almost smile from the corner of her eyes. It was the real thing, and it was tired and complicated, and had more history in it than a person her age should have, but it was real, and it crossed her whole face, and it changed every single thing about her expression. "You're a stubborn man, Caleb Whitaker," she said. "Mountain living," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, short, surprised by itself, the laugh of someone who'd forgotten what laughing felt like, and found it unexpectedly. And then the laugh faded, and she looked at him with those clear gray eyes that were softer now than he'd ever seen them, and she put her hand on top of his on the table. Just that. Just her hand over his. Neither of them moved for a moment, or egg. Outside, the summer dark had come down full over Black Pine Mountain, and somewhere down in the valley, Harrison Vane was reading the telegram about the federal injunction and deciding what to do next, and there would be more to come. Caleb knew that Eleanor knew that, but right now there was lamplight and a hand over his, and a woman who had just laughed for the first time in what felt like years. The mountain was quiet, until it wasn't. The sound came from outside, not horses on the road, not the ridge, but close. The yard, moving fast and deliberately, more than one person, the crunch of boots on the dry summer ground. Caleb was standing before the sound finished, registering, his hand moving to his sidearm, and Eleanor was on her feet, half a second behind him, with a steadiness that still surprised him, no matter how many times he saw it. Then Tom's voice, sharp and carrying through the window. "Caleb, front yard, now." Tom didn't raise his voice. In 11 years, Caleb could count on one hand the times Tom Garrett had raised his voice. The fact that it was raised now meant one thing. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Stay inside," he said. She looked at him with an expression that very clearly indicated she was not going to stay inside. He didn't waste time arguing. He went out the front door with her one step behind him, and what he found in the yard was not the 8 riders. From the first night, not Vane's men on horses, not anything he'd prepared for. It was Deputy Earl Sims. And beside him, hands bound in front of him, sitting on a horse, was a man Caleb didn't recognize. Young 20s with the hard-worn look of someone who'd been doing rough work for rough pay for a while. He had a split lip, and the particular expression of a man who had started the evening with a plan and was now on the wrong side of it. And tucked into Sims's coat, visible at the edge, was an envelope. Sims looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he looked at the man on the horse. "This one," Sims said, "was in your barn an hour ago. Jed found him." He paused. "Going through your saddlebags." Another pause. "And trying to get into the house." Caleb looked at the man on the horse. "Who sent you?" Caleb said. The man said nothing. Caleb looked at the envelope in Sims's coat. "That from him," he said. Sims pulled the envelope out and looked at it for a moment. Looked at it the way a man looks at something he's been holding and has finally decided what to do with. He held it out to Caleb. Caleb took it, opened it. Inside was not a letter. Inside was a deed. The deed to Black Pine Ranch. Signed over fraudulently, with a notarization that hadn't existed this morning, to the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company. The date on the deed was yesterday. Caleb stood in the yard holding a forged deed to his own land and looked at it for one long, very quiet moment. Then he looked up. Eleanor had seen it over his shoulder. Her face had gone still and pale, and then, as he watched, had gone to something harder than either of those things. "He's not just trying to get me back," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. "He's trying to take your land, to give himself legal standing to be on this property." She looked at Sims. "If that deed stands." "It won't stand," Sims said. And in his voice was something different, something that had not been there the day he'd come up with Vane's complaint, something that sounded like a man who had been waiting for the right side of something to become clear enough to stand on. "I found it on him before he could do anything with it. It hasn't been filed. It won't be filed." He looked at Caleb. "I'll be holding it as evidence." Caleb looked at him. "Earl," he said. "Don't," Sims said quietly. "Just don't. I know what I should have done 6 months ago. I know what I should have done a year ago." He looked at the man on the horse. "I know what I'm doing now." He turned his horse. "I'll be back tomorrow with federal marshals," Sims said. Judge Tessier called them from town before he rode back to Billings. "They're coming from the district office." He paused at the gate and looked back over his shoulder. "Keep your doors locked tonight, Caleb." Then he rode out, taking his prisoner with him. The yard was quiet. Caleb stood with the forged deed in his hand, and Eleanor stood beside him, and Tom was behind them, and Jed was somewhere in the dark by the barn, and the summer night pressed down on all of them, warm and breathless. "He tried to take your land," Eleanor said, very quietly. "Because of me." Caleb folded the deed and put it in his shirt pocket. "He tried," he said. Caleb. "He tried," Caleb said again. He turned and looked at her. His voice was completely even the way it got when he'd moved through anger and come out the other side into something quieter and more resolute. "And tomorrow, there are federal marshals coming, and a forged deed in Sim's pocket that's going to add about 3 more charges to what Tessier's already building." He held her gaze. "Harrison Vane just made the worst mistake a cornered man can make." "What's that?" she said. "He stopped being patient," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him. In the summer dark on the porch of the ranch he'd built with his own hands for 11 years. She looked at him with those gray eyes that were not afraid right now, not calculating, not watchful, not running any of the old calculations, just present and clear and looking at him. "What do we do tonight?" she said. "Tonight?" He said, "We lock the doors and we don't open them until morning." He held the door open. She went in. He followed. And the bolt slid home. Not the bolt on her room this time, but the front door of the house, the lock he hadn't turned in 11 years because he'd never had reason to, and the sound of it was the sound of a man who had stopped being alone on his mountain and hadn't quite understood until this moment exactly when that had happened. Nobody slept much. Caleb sat in the chair by the front window with his rifle across his knees and listened to the mountain, and the mountain was quiet. In the particular way it gets quiet when something is about to happen. Not peaceful quiet, but held, breath quiet. The kind where every small sound is too loud and every silence between sounds stretches too long. Tom had his bunk at the barn, and he'd gone to it, but Caleb could see the thin line of lamplight under the barn door that told him Tom wasn't sleeping either. Jed was on the far side of the property walking the perimeter, the way he did when he'd decided something needed walking slow and steady back and forth across the north side. Silas had been sent to the Paulson place, not because Mrs. Paulson needed guarding, but because Silas needed something to do with his hands and Mrs. Paulson had a shotgun and the good sense to use it. Eleanor came out of her room at midnight. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't apologize for being awake. She came down the hall and pulled the second chair to the window and sat in it with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, and for a while neither of them said anything. They just watched the dark together. After a while she said, "You should sleep." "So should you," he said. "I can't. Neither can I." He looked at her. "So we'll just be awake together and not argue about it." She almost smiled. Even in the dark, he could see the edge of it. They sat that way for another hour, watching the yard, watching the road where it disappeared around the bend toward Harrow Creek. Nothing moved. The ridge where Vane's men had sat for 3 days was empty. That was the part that made him uneasy. Not the movement, but the absence of it. Men who had been watching for 3 days had stopped watching, and he didn't think that was because they'd given up. He thought it was because they'd been recalled for something. He was still thinking about that when Eleanor said quietly, "My father used to sit up like this." He waited. "After the first time men came to talk to him about selling," she said, "he started sitting up at night. He never said why. He didn't want to frighten me." She was quiet for a moment. "I was 24. I wasn't frightened. I was angry. I kept telling him to go to the law, and he kept saying the law wasn't going to help us, and I thought he was being defeatist." She paused. "He was being accurate. He was being accurate about Harrow Creek," Caleb said. "He wasn't wrong to try anyway." "No," she said. "He wasn't wrong to try." She looked at her hands. "I just wish I'd sat up with him instead of going to bed thinking he was worrying too much." She paused. "I never told him I thought he was brave. I kept thinking there'd be time." The chair creaked when Caleb shifted his weight. Outside, the summer dark held its breath. "He knew," Caleb said. "You can't know that. He left you a letter that said you were the best thing he ever did," Caleb said. "A man who writes that knows his daughter well enough to know what she thinks of him." He looked at her. He knew Ellie. She pressed her lips together, looked at the window. "I'm going to be fine," she said. "Not to him, or not only to him. I need you to know that. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm going to be fine." "I know you are," he said. "I just need to say it out loud." "Then say it." She looked at the dark outside. "I'm going to be fine," she said again. And this time it landed differently, like something settling into place, rather than something that needed convincing. Caleb looked at her in the dark. At the line of her jaw, and the steadiness of her eyes, and the way she held herself in the chair like a woman who had decided at some point in the last 2 years that she was not going to let hard things make her smaller. He thought about what the judge had said on the road. What the law cannot do is tell a woman who spent 2 years running that she's allowed to stop. He thought about 11 years on a mountain, and a door he hadn't locked in all that time. "Ellie," he said. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "when Vane is handled, and the marshals have come, and the court has done what courts do, what do you want?" She looked at him carefully. "What do I want?" she repeated. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Really quiet, the kind that meant she was actually looking for the answer rather than deciding whether to give it. "I want to stop moving," she said. "I want to wake up in the same place 2 mornings in a row and not immediately calculate whether it's still safe." She paused. I want ground under me, not borrowed ground, not temporary ground." She looked at him. "I want somewhere that's mine." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "This mountain's got room," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Not the calculating look, not the measuring look, just looking at him the way a person looks when they're deciding whether to let something be real. "You're asking me to stay," she said. "I'm telling you there's room," he said. "What you do with that information is your business." Something moved across her face, complicated and warm, and more unguarded than he'd ever seen her. "Stubborn man," she said softly. "So you keep telling me," he said. She shook her head once very slightly and turned back to the window. And he turned back to the window. And they sat there together through the rest of the night. And the mountain held its breath, and nothing moved in the dark. And that was almost enough to be afraid of all by itself. The federal marshals arrived at 7 in the morning. There were 4 of them out of the district office in Billings, riding in the particular formation of men who are on official business and want everyone they pass to understand that. They came through the gate while Caleb was at the barn, and Eleanor was at the house, and behind them, which was the part Caleb hadn't expected, was Judge Tessier. The judge had not gone back to Billings after all. He looked at Caleb over the back of his horse and said, "I changed my mind about leaving. Thought I'd see it through." Caleb looked at him. "Glad you did," he said. Franklin Dade was behind the judge, and behind Franklin was a man Caleb didn't recognize, older, with the compact, contained look of someone whose profession required him to take up as little space as possible. Franklin introduced him as Mr. Aldridge, from the district attorney's office in Billings. They came inside, and the kitchen that had already been crowded all week became something like a command post. Maps came out. Documents came out. Tom's list of names came out. Eleanor sat at the center of it, with the leather case open in front of her, and walked Aldridge through every item with the same clear sequential precision she'd used with the judge 2 days prior. Caleb stood near the door and watched her. She was different this morning. Not a large difference, not visible to someone who hadn't been watching her closely for the past week. But he saw it. She was sitting straighter, not the rigid straight of someone holding themselves together, but the relaxed straight of someone who had put something down and found that their spine remembered how to work without it. She looked like a woman on solid ground. Halfway through Aldridge's questions, one of the marshals came in from outside and said something quietly to the lead marshal, a large, methodical man named Briggs, who had said very little since arriving, and gave the impression of someone who found most conversation inefficient. Briggs looked at Caleb. "Harrison Vane is in Harrow Creek," Briggs said. "Arrived this morning. He's at the courthouse." The room went very still. Eleanor looked up from the documents. "The courthouse," she said. "He filed a motion this morning," Briggs said, "challenging the federal injunction on jurisdictional grounds. He's claiming the county court has prior standing." He paused. "He brought a lawyer from Helena." Franklin Dade made a sound that was not quite a word. "He's trying to fight it locally," Franklin said. "He thinks if he can get a county judge to rule before the federal court acts." "He's stalling," Eleanor said. Her voice was very steady. "He knows the evidence is already in federal hands. He's trying to create a competing legal proceeding to complicate the timeline." She looked at Judge Tessier. "Can he do that?" "He can try," Tessier said, and the particular patience in his voice was the patience of a man who has watched ambitious criminals try things for 30 years. "And the county court will likely oblige him, because county courts in territories like this one tend to be accommodating to men like Vane." He looked at Briggs. "Which is why we need to move today, not tomorrow." Briggs nodded like this was already what he'd decided. "Then we go to town," he said. Bon. The ride down to Harrow Creek had the particular quality of a thing that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at itself. Caleb rode beside Eleanor. Behind them came the 4 marshals and Franklin Dade and Judge Tessier and Tom, who had declared without discussion that he was coming, and Jed, who had saddled his horse without being asked, and Silas, who had appeared from the direction of the Paulson place that morning with Mrs. Paulson herself, who had declared with equal firmness that she was also coming. They were 9 people riding down a mountain toward a town that had been for 2 years the place Eleanor Carter could not go. She rode with her back straight and her eyes forward, and she did not look at Caleb until they were halfway down the valley. And then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. But something passed between them in that look. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the quieter thing that lives underneath acknowledgement. Then she looked forward again. The main street of Harrow Creek on a Friday morning was not empty. It never was. People had business, life continued. But it went quiet in that particular way. A town goes quiet when something consequential is happening. Caleb had seen it before years ago, before the mountain. A kind of collective attention, people stopping on sidewalks and in doorways watching. They tied their horses at the courthouse rail. Briggs went in first with 2 of his men, and Caleb held the door for Eleanor, and they went in together. The Harrow Creek Courthouse was one large room on the ground floor with a judge's bench at the far end, and 2 tables for opposing counsel, and a gallery of wooden chairs that were this morning half occupied by men Caleb didn't know. Men in good suits who had the look of people imported from somewhere with more money than Harrow Creek. Harrison Vane was at the near table. Caleb had never seen him before. He'd built a picture of the man over the past week from what Eleanor had said, and Tom had said, and what Sims had implied, and the picture had been of someone large and physical and overtly powerful. What he found instead was a man of about 55 medium height, well-dressed, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of argument. He had pale eyes and a measured quality to all his movements, the quality of a man who had learned early that control was more effective than force. He looked at the marshals when they came in. Then he looked at Eleanor. Something moved through his pale eyes, fast contained, recalculated. He was the kind of man who processed information quickly and didn't show his processing. He looked at Judge Tessier, and there just briefly something else moved across his face. Something that was not surprise exactly, because men like Vane trained themselves out of visible surprise, but was the cousin of it. The thing that happens when a plan has been built on a specific set of assumptions, and one of those assumptions has just walked through the door. His lawyer was on his feet before Tessier had fully entered. "Your Honor," the Helena lawyer said, a smooth, well-practiced voice, the voice of someone accustomed to courtrooms in places with more money and more marble than this one. "This proceeding is a county matter, and the presence of—" "Sit down," Judge Tessier said pleasantly. The Helena lawyer sat down. The county judge behind the bench, a man named Hooper, whom Caleb had seen around Harrow Creek for years, and had always understood to be the sort of man who found the path of least resistance by locating the nearest powerful person, and standing close to them, looked at Tessier with an expression of profound discomfort. "Judge Tessier," Hooper said, "I wasn't that as I didn't expect." "I imagine not," Tessier said. He set his satchel on the table and looked at Hooper with the particular calm of a man who outranks the room and is being gracious about it. "I have an active federal injunction covering all land transactions connected to the Eastern Montana Land and Mineral Company, filed yesterday at 2:47 in the afternoon from your own telegraph office." He pulled a document from the satchel. "Any county proceeding related to those transactions is stayed pending federal resolution. That includes whatever motion Mr. Vane's counsel has filed this morning." Hooper looked at the document. He looked at Vane. He looked at the marshals standing near the door with the contained patience of men who were not there to rush anything, but were absolutely there. He looked back at Tessier. "Of course," Hooper said. And the speed with which he said it, the almost grateful speed of a man who has been given an authority to comply with so that he doesn't have to choose a side, told Caleb everything he needed to know about Judge Hooper and the past several years of Harrow Creek legal proceedings. Vane's lawyer was on his feet again. "The jurisdictional question is not settled by Mr." Tessier glanced at the man with polite inquiry. "Aldous," the lawyer said. "Matthew Aldous." "Mr. Aldous," Tessier said with the tone of a man addressing someone who has made a minor social error. "The Judiciary Act is quite clear on federal supremacy in cases of multi-county fraud. If you'd like to argue jurisdiction, you're welcome to do so before the Federal Circuit Court in Billings, where I can arrange for you to be heard next month." He paused. "Or we can proceed with the matter at hand, which is the arrest of your client on 4 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, one count of forgery, filed yesterday evening, and one count of attempting to suborn false legal documentation. That last charge added at 7 this morning based on evidence recovered by Deputy Sims. He looked at Briggs. Marshal. Briggs moved. He was not a dramatic man, and he moved without drama. Simply crossed the room with his deputy beside him, and Harrison Vane stood, and his lawyer was talking, and Briggs paid no attention to the lawyer because the lawyer wasn't who he was there for. Vane looked at Briggs, then past Briggs at Eleanor. He looked at her for a long moment. Caleb watched Vane's face in that moment. He'd expected something, anger maybe, or the particular coldness of a man who was already calculating his next move. What he saw instead was something he hadn't anticipated, a kind of recognition. The look of a man who has been engaged in a contest and has just in this moment understood that he lost it. "Miss Carter," Vane said. His voice was level, precise. "I underestimated you." Eleanor looked at him. She didn't move. She stood exactly where she'd been standing, and she looked at Harrison Vane with those clear gray eyes, and what was in her eyes was not triumph and not fear, and not the anger Caleb might have expected, given everything this man had taken from her and done to her father. What was in her eyes was something quieter and more final than any of those things. "My father believed in the system," she said. "I thought for a long time he was wrong." She paused. "Turns out he was just early." Vane looked at her for one more moment. Then Briggs put the irons on him, and he stopped looking at anyone. The Helena lawyer was already talking about writs and appeals, and the procedural irregularities of the morning's proceedings, all of which Tessier listened to with the patient attention of a man who intends to address exactly none of it right now. And Briggs walked Harrison Vane through the courthouse door and out into the Harrow Creek Main Street, and the sound that came from outside. Not a cheer exactly, not organized enough for a cheer, but the collective exhale of a town that had been holding something for a very long time came through the walls and filled the room. Deputy Earl Sims was standing outside on the steps. He'd been there the whole time, Caleb realized, not inside, not part of the official proceedings, just standing outside on the steps of his courthouse, with his arms folded and his hat on, and the look of a man who had decided something the night before and was standing with his decision. Caleb stopped beside him, while Eleanor went ahead with Franklin and Tessier. The two men stood there together and watched Briggs' deputies put Vane on a horse for the ride to Billings. 23 years, Sims said. "That's a long time," Caleb said. "I told myself for 23 years that I was being smart, that you pick your battles, that the system works if you're patient." He was quiet for a moment. "Turns out patience without action is just a different kind of choosing a side." Caleb looked at him. "You came last night," he said. "That's not nothing." "It's late," Sims said. "It's real late." "Most things are," Caleb said. "Doesn't mean they count less." Sims looked at him with the particular sideways expression of a man who is being offered grace he's not sure he deserves. "What happens to this town now?" Sims said. Caleb looked down the main street of Harrow Creek, at the people who had come out of shops and offices to stand and watch, at the faces he recognized, and some he didn't, at a town that had been shaped for years by the gravity of one powerful man's money and need. "It goes back to being a town," Caleb said. "That's all. Just a town." Sims nodded slowly. "I'm going to need to make some visits," Sims said. "To some families. People who were told things that weren't true about their land. People who were scared into things." He paused. "I know where they are." "Tom Garrett has a list," Caleb said. 11 names. He knows most of them personally." Sims looked at him. "You think he'd talk to me?" "I think if you say the right things," Caleb said, "Tom Garrett will talk to anyone." Mrs. Paulson found Eleanor on the sidewalk outside the courthouse. Caleb saw it from 30 feet away, the older woman walking toward Eleanor with a purpose that was different from the way she'd walked anywhere earlier in the week. A lightness under the purpose, and Eleanor turning to see her. And something happening in Eleanor's face that was not small, and was not contained, and was not going to be. Mrs. Paulson put both her hands on Eleanor's face the way an older woman does with someone younger, who she has decided matters to her, and said something that Caleb couldn't hear from where he was standing. Eleanor's face did the thing it had been keeping from doing for 2 years. She didn't make a sound, but her eyes filled, and one hand came up and covered Mrs. Paulson's hands, and she closed her eyes for a moment, and the thing she'd been carrying, not just for 2 years, not just since her father died, but for longer. The particular loneliness of being someone who has been let down by people and has spent a long time trying not to need them too much, moved visibly through her and didn't stay. Caleb looked away. Some moments were not for watching. Some moments belonged entirely to the people in them. Tom appeared at his shoulder. "She all right?" Tom said. "She's fine," Caleb said. "She's better than fine." Tom looked at Mrs. Paulson with Eleanor's hand over hers, and made the same expression he'd made at the kitchen table the night Mrs. Paulson had come to supper, the expression of a man who is moved and not going to say so. "You know," Tom said, "she reminds me of someone." Caleb looked at him. "Her father," Tom said. "Something in the way she thinks, the way she holds things together when things ought to be falling apart." He paused. "Daniel Carter was a good man. I didn't know him well, but I knew him enough." Another pause. "She does him credit." Caleb looked at Eleanor, who had both her hands around Mrs. Paulson's now, and was laughing and crying in the particular combination that happens when something has been tight for too long and releases all at once. "Yes," he said, "she does." They rode back up the mountain in the early afternoon. The 4 marshals had gone with Vane. Franklin Dade had business to complete with Aldridge from the district attorney's office. Judge Tessier said his goodbyes at the courthouse with the manner of a man who considers this outcome a reasonable morning's work and was already thinking about his next case. It was Caleb and Eleanor and Tom and Jed and Silas riding back up, and Mrs. Paulson who rode as far as the Creek Road turnoff before she went home, and she and Eleanor held each other's hands across the gap between their horses for a long moment before they parted. They didn't talk much on the way up. There wasn't much that needed saying. Halfway up the mountain in the place where the road curved and the valley opened up below, and Black Pine Ranch became visible above the roofline. The barn, the fence posts catching the afternoon light. Eleanor stopped her horse. She stopped it and she looked. Not at the valley, not at the town behind them, at the ranch above. Caleb stopped beside her. She was looking at it the way a person looks at something they hadn't let themselves look at before, really look at without the calculation running behind the looking. "It's a good ranch," she said. 11 years of work, he said. "I know." She looked at it a moment longer. "I've been working on it for a week, and I can feel where the work is. In the fence posts, in the barn doors, in the way the water lines run." She paused. "That kind of work has weight to it. You can feel who did it and what they were thinking when they did it." Caleb looked at her. "What was I thinking?" he said. She looked at the ranch for another moment. "That you were staying," she said. "That you'd decided to stay, and you were going to do it right." She turned to look at him. That staying was its own kind of thing worth doing even without anyone to do it with. He held her gaze. "You're right," he said. "That's what I was thinking." A pause. "It's better with someone to do it with." She looked at him with those gray eyes that were not guarded right now, not calculating, not watching the distance for danger, just looking at him, on solid ground. "I'm not a simple woman," she said. "I don't know how to be simple. I've got opinions about everything, and I argue, and I work harder than most men think is appropriate, and I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not Nora." "No," he said. "You're not Nora. I know you loved her. I did. And I'm not asking you to—" "Ellie," he said. She stopped. "I know who you are," he said. "I've been watching you work and think and fight and hold yourself together for a week on about 4 hours of sleep. I know who you are." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to be simple. I'm not asking you to be anyone other than exactly what you are." He paused. "The mountain's got room and so do I. That's what I said and I meant it." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon sun came down warm on the valley below them and warm on the roofline of the ranch above. And the mountain was quiet, in the way it gets in the middle of a summer afternoon, when the morning's business is done and the evening hasn't started. Then she said very quietly, "All right." 2 words, simple ones. But she said them with the particular weight of someone who has spent a long time being homeless and has just said yes to a door. Caleb looked at her. "All right," he agreed. They rode up the mountain together. It was Tom who found the second document. He found it late that afternoon going through the papers that had been left in the rush of the morning. Aldridge had taken the primary documents with him. But Tom had been going through the copies they'd made, checking names against his list, and he came into the kitchen with a piece of paper and his face doing something complicated. "Caleb," he said. Caleb was at the table with Eleanor. She looked up when she heard Tom's voice. Tom set the paper on the table. It was one of the copies, not an original, a copy Eleanor had made in her small, precise handwriting of the ledger page from Vane's accounts. They'd given the original to Aldridge, but the copy was there, and Tom had found something in it that they had missed. "This entry," Tom said. He put his finger on a line near the bottom. "This name, right there." Caleb looked at it. The name was Hooper. County Judge Hooper. $50. 2 years ago, the month Daniel Carter had his accident. Eleanor went very still. She looked at the entry for a long moment. "He paid the judge," she said, very quietly. Before the accident, he was buying the legal cover in advance. She looked up at Caleb. "Which means the accident wasn't they had it planned. They planned it and then they bought the legal outcome before they did it." The kitchen was very quiet. Tom looked at Caleb with an expression that was controlled and tired and very old. "That goes to Aldridge," Caleb said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Her voice was absolutely steady. "Yes, it does." She pulled the paper toward her. "First thing tomorrow. I'm writing it up tonight." Caleb looked at her. She was holding the paper, and her hands were steady, and her eyes were clear, and she was already thinking, already working, already pulling the threads, already building the next part of the case. Not because she couldn't stop, but because she was the kind of person who, once she had decided something mattered, did not stop until it was finished. "Ellie," he said. She looked up. "Your father's going to get justice," he said. She looked at him. The steadiness in her face did something just briefly, just for a moment, the way a face does when someone has said the one true thing and the body acknowledges it before the mind can decide whether to let it in. Then she nodded once. "Yes," she said, "he is." She looked back down at the paper. Tom went quietly out the door. Caleb stayed at the table and watched Eleanor Carter work in the last of the afternoon light, and the ranch around them was quiet and warm and solid. And outside the mountain stood the way it had always stood, patient and present and indifferent to everything that wasn't real. What was real was a woman with a pen in her hand writing down the truth. What was real was a ranch with its door unlocked and its lamps burning. What was real was the slow, specific thing that had been building between two people who had both spent a very long time alone and had arrived by different roads and at considerable cost at the same kitchen table. The mountain held all of it. It always had. The letter from Billings came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Harrison Vane had been walked out of the Harrow Creek Courthouse in Irons. Eleanor was in the barn when Silas brought it up from town. She heard him coming. She always heard people coming now. But it was different from before. Less like a survival instinct, and more like simple awareness. The way a person listens for familiar footsteps in a house they've started thinking of as home. She came out of the stall where she'd been checking Duchess's shoulder. The muscle tension had resolved, just as she'd expected it would, and wiped her hands on her work trousers, and took the letter from Silas without ceremony. She read it standing in the barn doorway with the summer light behind her. Then she read it again. Silas watched her face and tried to determine from her expression whether the news was good or catastrophic, because Eleanor Carter's face when she was reading something important had a quality of absolute stillness that made it genuinely difficult to tell. "Well," he finally said. He was 24, and patience had never been his strongest quality. Eleanor looked up. "Harrison Vane has entered a guilty plea on 3 counts of federal fraud," she said. The district attorney accepted it in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into Judge Hooper and the 2 county officials named in the ledger. She paused. "Cooperation includes a complete accounting of all land transactions conducted under fraudulent pretense over the past 4 years." Silas stared at her. That means 14 families, Eleanor said. 14 families get to make claims on what was taken from them. She looked back at the letter. "The Carter land is included." Silas let out a breath that was more of a sound than a word. Eleanor folded the letter with the same careful hands she used on everything that mattered, and she stood there in the barn doorway for a moment, with the folded letter against her chest, and she looked at nothing in particular, and Silas, to his credit, understood that this was a moment that belonged to her, and said nothing. Then she said, "Where's Caleb?" "North fence line," Silas said. "Same place he always is when he's thinking." She went. She found him where Silas sat at the north fence, the same stretch he'd been working the night she'd come through his gate. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him the way he always did, and he looked at her face and read it the way he'd learned to read it over the past month, the particular quality of her eyes, the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding the letter. She held it out. He took it, read it. He read it the way he read things that mattered slowly twice, making sure he had all of it before he decided what to say. When he was done, he refolded it along her crease lines and handed it back. "Guilty plea," he said. 3 counts, she said. "With full cooperation. Hooper is being investigated. Both county officials named in the ledger have already resigned." She looked at him. "And the Carter land, my father's ranch, it's part of the restitution claim." Caleb looked at her. He knew what question was coming. He'd known for a week that it was coming, had seen it building in her the way weather builds on the mountain, the slow accumulation of something that will eventually need to become a decision. She knew he knew. That was the thing about a month of working and talking and sitting up at night together. Very little needed explaining anymore. "I need to go to Billings," she said, "to file the claim, to sit with Franklin and go through the restitution process." She held his gaze. "And then I need to decide what to do with a piece of land in Carter Creek." "You could sell it," he said. "I could," she said. "Or you could work it again." "I could," she said again. He looked at the fence line, at the mountain above them and the valley below, at 11 years of work spread out in every direction. "What do you want, Ellie?" he said. Not for the first time. He'd asked her that question on the night before the marshals came, and she'd given him an answer about solid ground and staying. He was asking it again because the situation had changed, and he wanted to know if the answer had. She looked at him for a long moment. "Carter Creek is 2 days' ride," she said. "Yes." "And Black Pine is here." "Yes, and I have been," she said slowly, precisely like a woman choosing her words because they are going to matter. "Waking up in the same place every morning for a month. And I have been watching the same ridge every morning and knowing those men are gone. And I have been eating at the same table and working with the same horses and talking to the same people." She paused. "And I have not once calculated the distance to the door." Caleb held very still. "Caleb," she said. "Yes. I don't want Carter Creek," she said. "I want to file the claim because it's mine and my father died for it, and I am going to make sure it's officially returned to Carter hands before I do anything with it." Her eyes were completely clear. "And then I want to come back here, if that offer is still open." He looked at her. "The mountain's got room," he said. "I said that before and it hasn't changed." "I know what you said," she said. I'm asking if you mean more than that. He'd been a man who chose words carefully for 11 years. Lived alone long enough to understand that saying the wrong thing was worse than saying nothing, and that saying nothing too long was its own kind of wrong. He stepped forward. Not far, one step the gap between them going from polite to something else. He put his hand against the side of her face, and she turned her face into it, just slightly, the way a person turns toward warmth when they haven't had warmth in a long time and have almost forgotten what it feels like. I mean considerably more than that, he said. She looked up at him. Good, she said. Because so do I. He kissed her the way he did everything without waste and without drama, just direct and true, and entirely present. And she kissed him back with the particular honesty of a woman who had stopped running and knew it, who had put her feet on solid ground and recognized it, and was not going to pretend otherwise. Above them the mountain held its summer quiet. Below them the valley stretched out long and warm and real. And at the north fence line of Black Pine Ranch, in the place where this had all begun, two people who had each come to the end of something found each other at the beginning of something else. She left for Billings 4 days later. Caleb rode with her as far as Harrow Creek. Franklin Dade met her there. He'd come up from Miles City specifically, which told Caleb something about the kind of lawyer Franklin was, and she transferred to the stage with a single bag and the leather case that had been her constant companion for 2 years. At the stage, she turned and looked at Caleb. He'd been expecting some kind of goodbye that required managing. He'd been braced for the version of Eleanor that calculated distances and kept things contained, the version she'd arrived with. Instead, she walked back to him, put one hand on his chest, and looked up at him with the clearest eyes he'd ever seen on a person. "Don't fix the north fence without me," she said. "I want to help." He blinked. "You want to help fix fence?" "I want to work on what's mine," she said. "And that fence is going to be partly mine, so yes." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded once, decisive, and turned and got on the stage. He stood in the Harrow Creek street and watched it go, and Tom, who had insisted on coming to town because Tom insisted on being present for things he considered significant, appeared at his elbow. "She coming back," Tom said. "Yes," Caleb said. Tom nodded like this was the correct answer and had never been in doubt. "Good," he said, "because Duchess is going to miss her." Caleb looked at the old man. Tom looked straight ahead down the road where the stage had gone, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was moved and wasn't going to admit it. "Just the horse," Tom said. "That's all I meant." "Right," Caleb said. They rode back up the mountain. She was gone 12 days. 12 days that had the quality of a held note, not empty, not painful, just extended. Caleb worked the ranch the way he always worked it, methodically without waste. But he noticed things he hadn't noticed before the second chair at the kitchen table. The mug she'd used that first night, which he'd washed and placed on a specific shelf without making a decision to do so. The way Duchess looked toward the east pasture gate at roughly the same time each morning, which was roughly the time Eleanor usually came to the barn. Animals always knew. Tom added 3 more names to his list of people he was going to talk to, families affected by Vane's fraud who hadn't yet come forward. He talked to them all. 2 of them had filed restitution claims through Franklin's office by the end of the first week. The third needed more time, which Tom respected, with the particular patience of a man who understood that trust was not a thing you rushed. Sims came up to the ranch on the 3rd day with his hat in his hands, and an expression that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be. He and Tom sat on the porch for 2 hours, and Caleb left them to it, because it was between those 2 men, and what was between them needed to be said without audience. When Sims left, Tom came inside and poured himself coffee and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "He's going to do right." "I know," Caleb said. "Doesn't undo what he didn't do before." "No," Caleb said, "but it means something." Tom considered this. "It means something," he agreed. Silas spent the 12 days in a state of restless productivity that resulted in the barn being cleaner than it had been in 5 years, and the east pasture fence being entirely reposted, which was work that had needed doing, and which Silas had attacked with the energy of someone who needed to feel useful while the important things were happening. Caleb let him go at it. Silas was 24, and the best thing you could do with 24 was give it a fence to fix. Jed said nothing and sharpened things. Caleb fixed the north fence himself on the 8th day, because it needed doing, and the elk weren't going to wait. But he left one section, a 10-post stretch, at the far end, the roughest part, the part that would need 2 people untouched. He was going to make himself keep that promise. Joa. She came back on a Wednesday afternoon. Not on the stage. She'd bought a horse in Billings, a gray mare with a ground-eating stride, and the particular alert quality of an animal that had been well chosen by someone who knew horses. She came up the mountain road in the early afternoon, and Caleb was at the barn, and Duchess lifted her head and looked east a full 2 minutes before Eleanor appeared around the bend. He walked to the gate. She pulled up and looked at him from the saddle with those clear gray eyes. "The claim is filed," she said. "It's going to take time. Franklin says 4 to 6 months for the restitution process, but it's filed and it's official and it's going to hold." "And Hooper," Caleb said, "resigned and under investigation." She swung down from the gray mare with the fluid ease of someone who'd been riding most of her life. "The 2 county officials from the Ledger have both given statements implicating Vane in my father's death. It's being reclassified from accidental to suspicious pending formal investigation." She looked at him. "He's going to be charged for my father. It's going to take longer, but it's going to happen." Caleb looked at her. She was standing in front of him with 12 days of road on her and the gray mare blowing beside her, and she looked different. Not in any single visible way. Just altogether different from the woman who had fallen through his gate a month and a half ago. Like a person who has set something down and had time to notice the weight was gone. "You look like yourself," he said. She blinked. "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure exactly," he said. "Just you look like yourself. The version of yourself that isn't carrying everything." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I brought something back from Billings." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small package brown paper tied with string, the kind of package a person makes when they've found something in a shop and wrapped it themselves. She held it out. He took it, looked at her. "Open it," she said. He pulled the string and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a photograph, small, framed in plain wood. A man of about 50 standing in front of a ranch fence, looking at the camera with the particular self-consciousness of a person who didn't have their picture taken often and wasn't sure what to do with their hands. He had Eleanor's jaw and Eleanor's eyes and the look of a man who spent his life outdoors. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long moment. "His name was Daniel Carter," Eleanor said. Her voice was completely steady. "And I thought he should be somewhere. Not just in a leather case. Somewhere he can be seen." She paused. "If that's all right?" Caleb looked at the photograph and then at her. "Where do you want him?" he said. She looked at the ranch house. "Kitchen shelf," she said. "Where the lamp is, so there's light on him." Caleb looked at the photograph one more time. At the man with Eleanor's eyes, who had spent a year collecting evidence by himself, and written his daughter a letter, and hidden it in the lining of her bag, because he'd understood what was coming, and wanted to make sure she had something to hold on to. "Kitchen shelf," he said. "That's exactly right." They walked inside together. The first week she was back had a different quality from the weeks before. Not quieter, if anything, it was louder, fuller, more present in every way. Mrs. Paulson came up twice, and the second time she brought her daughter, who had ridden in from Wyoming, a serious-faced woman of 35, who shook Eleanor's hand and said her mother had told her everything, and that she was glad there were still people willing to do the right thing. Tom had a meeting with the Briggs family, one of the 14 from his list, and came home looking older and more tired, but also more settled the way a man looks when he's done something he should have done and knows it. Silas fell dramatically in love with Mrs. Paulson's daughter, which everyone saw happening in real time and nobody said anything about. Jed said nothing. He did sharpen one final thing, a fence post driver that hadn't needed sharpening, and then appeared to be done with sharpening things entirely, as though the crisis had required a certain volume of edge maintenance and the volume had been met. Eleanor worked. She worked the way she always worked, thoroughly, without theater starting early and stopping when the work was done, rather than when the clock said. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the way she learned everything by paying close attention and asking direct questions, and not pretending she knew things she didn't. And she shared what she knew about horses, about bookkeeping, about the particular way a land dispute document needed to be organized for a federal court without making a performance of the sharing. She and Caleb moved around each other in the way of people who are figuring out a shared life and finding to their mutual surprise that it is less difficult than either of them expected. Not without friction, Eleanor had opinions about the waterline routing on the east pasture that she expressed clearly and at length, and she was right, which Caleb acknowledged with the particular grace of a man who has lived alone long enough to know that being right wasn't the same as being alone anymore. He had thoughts about the way she organized the ranch accounts that he also expressed clearly, and she absorbed them with the particular grace of a woman who could hear correction without hearing attack. They argued twice in 3 weeks about real things, and both times the arguments resolved into something better than where they'd started. Not because either of them backed down, but because both of them were more interested in the truth than in winning. Tom watched all of this with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things over 61 years and had the wisdom to appreciate the good ones when they arrived. On a Saturday morning in early September, 3 weeks after Eleanor came back from Billings, Caleb woke up before sunrise and lay in bed for a moment and listened to the ranch. He could hear the horses moving in the barn. He could hear Tom's boots on the floor of his quarters. The old man rose before the sun, without fail, a lifetime's habit that nothing had ever broken. He could hear the early birds doing what early birds did in Montana in September, when the summer was beginning to remember it had somewhere else to be, and he could hear Eleanor in the kitchen. The small sounds of a person who has learned a space, the particular silence of how she poured coffee, the way she set things down with care because she'd worked in documents all her adult life and had the habit of treating things gently, the sound of her pulling the chair out at the table. The kitchen shelf where he'd put her father's photograph was right there beside the lamp, and he thought about her looking at it in the morning, the way he thought about a lot of things she did not, analyzing it, just knowing it was happening and finding it true. He got up. He came down the hall, and she was at the table with her coffee, and his was already poured sitting across from hers, because she'd done that every morning since she came back, poured his coffee and left it there, which was a small thing, and not a small thing at all. He sat down. She looked up. "Sleep all right?" she said. "Better than I used to," he said. She looked at him with the corner of the almost smile, which was not an almost smile anymore. It was a real smile that had simply become comfortable being itself, rather than reaching for its full width every time. "Tom's making a list of winter repairs," she said. "I looked at it last night. There are 6 things on it that should be 7. "What's the 7th? "The roof on the south side of the barn. There's a weak section above the 3rd stall. It'll hold through fall, but not through a hard winter." Caleb thought about the 3rd stall and about what he'd told himself last spring about getting to that roof this summer and then not having gotten to it. "You're right," he said. She nodded like this was settled and picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat like that for a moment, the kitchen quiet around them. Her father's photograph on the shelf, with the lamp's early light on it, the mountain outside, beginning to do what mountains do in September, when the season turns, announcing itself through the quality of the morning air. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, I've been thinking about the Carter land." She held her coffee in both hands the way she did when she was about to say something she'd been working toward. "When the restitution comes through, and it will come through, I'm not going to work it. It's too far. It's 2 days from here, and I don't want to be 2 days from here." She looked at him. "But I also don't want to sell it to a stranger." "What are you thinking?" he said. "The Moreno family," she said. "They're on Tom's list. They lost their place on the Eastern Creek, not their original land, but land they'd been working. Good family. 3 sons who know ranching." She paused. The Carter land is good land. Water access, decent grazing, the house is still standing. Franklin says we could structure a long-term lease that converts to purchase over 10 years, something they could actually afford. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him with those clear eyes. Your father built that ranch, he said. Yes, she said. And I want someone to work it who needs it the way he needed it. Not as an investment, as a home. She paused. He would have liked that. Caleb thought about the photograph on the shelf, about a man who had spent a year collecting evidence because he believed in doing the right thing and had written his daughter a letter about trust and not being alone. He would have liked that very much, Caleb said. She nodded, settled like the thing had been decided. He looked at her, this woman who had come to his gate with nothing but a leather case and a horse that had given everything it had, and the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps moving because stopping isn't an option. He thought about what the judge had said on the road. What the law cannot do is tell a woman who spent 2 years running that she's allowed to stop. He thought about how wrong the judge had been about one part of that. Eleanor Carter had told herself. That was the thing nobody had seen coming. Not Vane, not Sims, maybe not even Eleanor herself, until she'd been still long enough to understand it. She hadn't stopped running because someone told her she could. She'd stopped because she'd made the decision the same way she made every decision, with her whole mind and both hands and the full weight of who she was. She'd chosen to stop. She'd chosen this mountain. She'd chosen him, and that was the thing that had changed everything, not the federal marshals, not the injunction, not even the guilty plea. Those were justice, and justice mattered, but they weren't the thing. The thing was a woman deciding that she was done letting a bad man define the size of her life. I left something for you, Caleb said, out at the north fence. She looked at him. The 10 posts. Thought you might want to help. She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that had been calculating survival for 2 years and were now doing something different entirely. Something that was warm and sure and entirely present. Today, she said. No reason to wait, he said. She stood up, finished her coffee, set the mug on the shelf beside her father's photograph with the particular care she used for things she valued. Then she looked at the photograph for a moment. Caleb watched her. She didn't say anything to it. She didn't need to. It was enough that it was there in the light scene. She picked up her hat from the peg by the door. Let's go fix your fence, she said. Our fence, he said. She stopped with her hand on the door, turned and looked at him, and this time the smile was the whole thing. No, almost about it. No corners holding back. Just Eleanor Carter in the early September light, with her hat in her hand, and her father on the shelf, and her whole future on a mountain she'd chosen. Our fence, she said. They went out together into the morning. San. Tom was already at the barn when they crossed the yard. He looked up when he heard them coming, looked at the two of them, walking together with the ease of people who have stopped negotiating the distance between themselves and just move, and his face did the thing it always did when he was moved and wasn't going to say so. He didn't say so. He just tipped his hat and went back to his work. Silas appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse and took in the situation with the quick assessment of the young and said, North fence. North fence, Caleb said. Silas grinned the particular grin of a 24-year-old who was pleased with the world and went to get the tools. Jed appeared last from wherever Jed always appeared from and looked at the group assembling and at Eleanor and at Caleb and at the tools Silas was collecting, and he said in full the most he had said in any single utterance in the entire 6 weeks of this story, about time. Then he picked up a post driver and walked north. Eleanor looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eleanor. About time, she agreed, and they followed. The north fence got fixed that morning, all 10 posts, the full rough stretch that had been waiting, the work going faster with 4 people than it would have gone with 1. Eleanor drove posts with the focused efficiency of someone who had been shown a thing once and had no intention of doing it wrong. And she and Caleb worked the same section without talking the way people work together when they've arrived at the kind of understanding that doesn't require constant narration. At one point, Tom looked over at them from where he was tamping the base of a new post and said to no one in particular, "You know, I've been on this ranch 11 years and I've never seen that fence done right." "It was waiting," Caleb said. Tom considered this. "Most good things are," he said. The mountain above them was beginning its September shift, the aspens on the upper slope already moving toward gold at their tips, the light coming in at the angle that meant summer had started packing. The air had that quality. It gets in early September. In Montana, still warm, but with a clarity in it that summer doesn't have. Like the season had stopped being lazy and decided to be present. When they were done, Eleanor stood back and looked at the fence line. All of it. The whole north stretch running true and solid from the post they'd started to the corner where it turned back toward the barn. She had her hands on her hips, and she was looking at it the way she'd looked at the ranch from the road the day they came back from Harrow Creek, really looking, not calculating, just taking it in. "It's good fence," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the mountain above the fence line, at the aspens going gold, at the sky that went on in September, the way it only goes on in big country, like the whole world is just sky and land and the distance between them. She breathed it in. She had been running for 2 years. Running from a man who had taken her father's land and her father's life and 2 years of her own life and had tried at the end to take a ranch that didn't belong to him and reduce Eleanor Carter to a name on a reward notice in a county paper. He had not managed it. He had not managed it because she hadn't let him, because she'd kept running when running was what was needed, and stopped running when stopping was what was needed, and because she'd had the particular kind of faith, not in the system, not in any one person, but in the accumulated weight of true things that her father had written to her about in a letter she'd read 200 times in 2 years and had finally this morning left on a shelf instead of carrying it in the leather case against her side. She didn't need to carry it anymore. She knew what it said. She turned and looked at Caleb. He was watching her the way he'd watched her from the first night, attentively, without performance, just present and paying attention and not looking away. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "That first night. When you came to the gate and those men were right behind me and you didn't know me and you didn't know what I'd done or what I had or what kind of trouble I was carrying." She looked at him. "And you just stepped forward." "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. "I've thought about it 100 times. What made you step forward when any reasonable man would have stepped back?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Because you fell through my gate and looked up at me with those eyes and said please, and there was only one kind of man I was willing to be in that moment." She looked at him. "What kind was that?" she said. "The kind that steps forward," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not the almost gesture, not the tentative thing, just took his hand, the way a person takes hold of something they've decided is theirs, firm and certain and without qualification. He held it. The mountain held them both. And the fence ran true and straight behind them in the September light, fixed at last, solid in the ground, built to hold through whatever winter came. It was a good fence. It was going to last. And on Black Pine Mountain, in the territory of Montana, in the summer, that became the autumn, that became the beginning of everything that came after Eleanor Carter, who had run for 2 years and stopped for good, stood on solid ground with her hand in the hand of a man who had stepped forward and looked out at a life she had chosen, and knew all the way down to the bone that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not passing through. She was not temporary. She was not running. She was home.